only kill black people. Yeah, we only kill black people, right?
On March 13, 2020 at 12:30 a.m., Breonna Taylor was asleep in her home when she and her boyfriend Kenneth Walker were suddenly awakened by sounds of their door being broken down. Believing it was a home invasion, Walker fired a warning shot with the weapon he legally owned. Louisville Metro police officers fired 32 times in response into their home. Breonna Taylor was hit 6 times and bled out in her own house. The police were supposed to be performing a drug raid, but no drugs were found. Instead, they arrested her boyfriend and let her bleed to death. In watching images of what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, I was not surprised at all, nor shocked at the lack of violence from police and the lack of effort to stop them and even helping them in some cases. What I was angered by was the memories that it conjured up of being chased through the streets, shot and tear gassed, and literally beaten and sexually assaulted by police for doing far less. Bias from police against both minorities and against leftist movements is undeniable. And watching it play out on that scale was terrifying and maddening. And I'm not saying the police should have been beating up those people more. I'm saying the police shouldn't have been beating up peaceful protesters at all. I'm saying that they shouldn't have shot Breonna Taylor in her home and let her die. I'm saying that when police beat on communities illegally and unfairly, any response that occurs from that community is tantamount to self-defense. Especially in places like LA, where the department that polices black and brown neighborhoods the most is also full of literal gangs that helped a killer cop get away with chasing ink and murdering an 18-year-old boy at his job, and then destroyed the evidence. If we want to do better as a society, we have to understand the history that got us where we are now with the police, and what the drawbacks and alternatives to that system are. You may have heard before that policing in America started with slave patrols, and that factoid is correct but not complete. While it's a significant fact that should make the entire American policing system objectively deserving of abolition, there are actually more reasons for us to hate the police that we're going to discuss now. Thankfully, this is basically the entirety of the book Rise of the Warrior Cop by Radley Balko. It's a very well-told history of policing, even though there are some things that I feel should have been included and, opinions, hot takes, that sort of thing. In the first few chapters, he makes connections between various forms of law enforcement throughout Western society, starting with Rome, then England, then the American colony. Rome's policing system, if it can even really be called that, started in response to assassinations against Roman politicians, though its effectiveness in stopping that was dubious to say the least. That being said, what started off as a primitive secret service soon expanded to basically doing the same things that police do now, responding to crimes and emergencies. After Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, Rome fell into chaos as the emperor's powerful factions maneuvered to seize power. Anticipating bloodshed, faction leaders began to pull elite troops from their armies to serve as bodyguards. These guard units came to be called Praetorian cohorts, after the Praetoria cohorts who guarded the tents of the Roman generals during war. By the end of the reign of the Emperor Augustus, and for the next several centuries, the Praetorian Guard would take on more of the roles that we now associate with conventional police forces, including investigating serious crimes, making arrests, providing security during Colosseum games, collecting taxes, spying on suspected revolutionaries, collecting undercover intelligence, and even fighting fires. This basically lays the beat for how many police departments in the future act, with some regional quirks for places with unique circumstances like England, where early sheriffs gave way to constables and organized police forces as urbanization grew among a burgeoning capitalist system. America faced similar issues during urbanization, as well as the issue of constant uprisings from the general public as the founding fathers stumbled ass first into creating their shit mess of a government and worked to suppress slave rebellions and uphold white supremacy. The Founding Fathers at first held the firm belief that America should not have a standing military, fearing the potential for tyranny and oppression such a force could pose. These fears led to what Balko calls the symbolic Third Amendment, essentially saying that the Third Amendment was a more robust expression of the threat that standing armies posed to free societies. It represented a long-standing, deeply ingrained resistance to armies patrolling American streets and policing American communities. Quartering itself, the specific burden of giving up a bed to a soldier, feeding him and clothing him, was not what edged cities like Boston to the brink of war. The actual quartering of British troops in the private homes of colonists was rare, at least up to the start of the American Revolution. It was the predictable fallout from positioning soldiers trained for warfare on city streets among the civilian populace and using them to enforce laws and maintain order that enraged colonists. Contemporary newspaper accounts documented frequent and increasingly bitter altercations between soldiers and citizens. Bostonians were British subjects, but they were being treated like enemies of the state. They began to interpret the stationing of troops in their city as an act of war. The American government, while at first putting much thought and work into preventing a militant law enforcement operation from springing up, quickly abandoned the ideas when they needed to put down protests and insurrections. This willingness to militarize also came about whenever issues of suppressing and securing slaves, especially runaways, came about. The Cushing Doctrine was introduced by pro-slavery politicians like Caleb Cushing and allowed marshals to call in assistance from the U.S. military based on their own perception of need, thus circumventing laws and bureaucracy that would have prevented this. Cushing and others used this law to hunt down fugitive slaves in anti-slavery states, and it was only created after mass protests in Boston erupted when a former slave was caught, arrested, and sent back to Virginia to re-enter slavery. It hadn't yet been 100 years since the Boston Massacre, in which British soldiers fired first into the air and then directly into a mob of angry protesters, effectively sparking the American Revolution. Yet, on the morning of June 2nd, 1854, it was U.S. soldiers who lined Boston streets, who fired shots from a cannon positioned in the town square as a warning to fellow Americans, and who used the threat of military force to silence the speech of American citizens. The reason for the protests? That a man who had escaped the yoke and found refuge in the arms of a free state was being sent back into bondage, only compounded the poignancy of the scene. Don't these circumstances just feel so familiar? As time went on, police forces similar to what we have now began to take the familiar shape we see these days. In the northern states of America, cities followed the example put forth by the British, with stronger, more organized and militaristic police forces becoming the norm. While the process of becoming a cop in New York, for example, was much more democratic in the sense of police being appointed and approved by local politicians, the position was precarious in situations of changing administrations and actively led to massive corruption within the policing system. The job of a police officer had quickly become a patronage position. The only qualification for becoming a cop was a political connection. Mass firings were common when power changed hands. The ethnicity of a ward's police force tended to be exclusively of the majority of the ward's population. This would be problematic for, say, an Italian caught in a majority Irish neighborhood. Training was non-existent, beatings were common, and, perhaps most importantly, the system had little effect on crime, neither preventing it nor helping bring criminals to justice. Reforms put in place to solve these issues worked to give police a more professional image and practices, a greater focus on crime control, greater authority, and eventually, with the rising gang violence and armament in relation to prohibition and the sudden creation of a new black market, more weapons and gear. In the less urban South, the primary enemy police faced were runaway slaves. Early policing squads were made up of white supremacist militias, mobilizing to hunt down and recapture and punish or kill escaped slaves, and black people who violated the black codes after slavery was reformed. The environments created by these policing agencies at this critical time in the building of American society as we know it would lead to much of our current view of police. Distant, faceless, dangerous men. People who live outside of the community, who don't understand it and don't care to. And as hatred for police festered, so did their capacity for violence, especially against people of color. And with that rising capacity for violence came a weakened accountability system for cops who abused that ability to do violence. So what we've seen is that as American society as we know it began to come together, oftentimes there were people who were left behind intentionally by the system, and the police rose up, yes, in part due to genuine crime and the need for a force capable of protecting people, but it's vastly more often the case that this force was utilized, and still is, by the capitalist class to secure profits and private property. And as history marched on, this is the role that police would play the most, enforcing the systems of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism, and classism that the ruling class relied on and still relies on in order to maintain power. Anyone trying to equalize that system in any capacity immediately became an enemy of the ruling class, and thus the state and the police. So with basic history and concepts out of the way, policing as we know it had almost been established, but there were still controversies being hashed out about how they were allowed to function, and the rights of those they accosted. When first coming up with the system that would create policing as we know it, the founding fathers referred to something called the castle doctrine. Balko talks about how back during the time of Rome, there was essentially the idea that violence in the home was not acceptable. Even if the Roman cops were investigating you or whatever, there was the general promise that they wouldn't bust into your home and smoke you like American cops do. Put simply, the castle doctrine holds that a man's home is his castle, but it springs from an older, much broader sentiment that the home should be protected as a place of refuge, peace, and sanctuary. One of the earliest recorded pronouncements of the idea came from the Roman statesman Cicero. What is more sacred, what is more strongly guarded by every holy feeling than a man's own home? Implicit in the sentiment is not only the right to repel criminal intruders, but also the idea that the state is permitted to violate the home's sanctity only under limited circumstances, only as a last resort, and only under conditions that protect the threshold from unnecessary violence. Thus, before entering without permission, government agents must knock and announce and identify themselves, state their purpose, and give occupants the opportunity to let them in peacefully. This kind of goes back to the whole symbolic Third Amendment, which, in also representing the hesitance to allow militarized law enforcement to patrol the city streets people live and work in, also extends to the home and community of the individual. Unfortunately, this doctrine would grow less and less important as time went on. Not to say those rules really applied to everyone equally in the first place. Black and brown people, during and post-slavery and even now, are not given this right. If you're black or brown, the police can bust into your home and kill you with almost no repercussions. They can break into your home with weapons soldiers used during wartime, while you're getting dressed after a shower, while you're giving your dog a bath, while you're playing Minecraft with your kids. Slave catchers that would eventually become police would routinely capture free and formerly enslaved black people to bring back to the South as slaves, even when they were legally free. During the era of Jim Crow and the Black Codes, they would regularly break into the homes of black people to arrest, beat, and lynch them. When ICE kidnaps people for deportation and sends them to concentration camps where they commit genocide by forcibly sterilizing people and keeping them in deadly conditions, it's the same thing. What Balko doesn't say often while talking about this issue is the way that this law is often used selectively based on whether the subject of it was white or colored, though he does make this gem of a point. A quick knock and announcement in the middle of the night followed by a forced entry 10 to 15 seconds later before anyone inside can wake and come to the door and peacefully grant the sheriff entrance would be only slightly less offensive to the doctrine's spirit than not knocking at all. It was during the war on drugs that this law really started to become irrelevant to an extent, as police and the state used the war on drugs as a pretext to abuse, harass, and murder black activists and community leaders, as well as crack down on anti-war protests. As discussed earlier, the knock and announce rule rose out of the common law tradition and the castle doctrine valued so highly by the American founders. To protect the sanctity of the home, the police were obligated to give a homeowner the opportunity to grant them entrance in order to prevent a violent confrontation. The destruction of his door and property, and the infliction of terror upon him and his family. Soder's direction to police to consider disposal time instead of the time it would take an occupant to come to the door not only does away with the notion that the purpose of the knock and announce rule is to give citizens the opportunity to avoid a confrontation, it also presupposes that all drug suspects are guilty. Soder's only concern was with making sure the knock and announce requirement doesn't give drug offenders the opportunity to destroy evidence, and every other justice agreed with him. In Banks, a unanimous court decided that preserving the evidence needed to convict people suspected of nonviolent consensual drug crimes was more important than protecting innocent people from the violence of a paramilitary-style police raid. 30 years after it began, the modern drug war had finally killed the castle doctrine. So far, for the most part, the book is pretty based, but there are a few comments that I have opinions about. No one made a decision to militarize the police in America. The change has come slowly, the result of a generation of politicians and public officials fanning and exploiting public fears by declaring war on abstractions like crime, drug use, and terrorism. The resulting policies have made those war metaphors increasingly real. But this isn't completely true. The decision to militarize the police was a conscious one, and the way that he outlines the history in his own writing shows that. When armed patrols were organized in the South to hunt slaves and then branded themselves as law enforcement, they knew what they were doing. Many of them fought in or supported the South during the Civil War. When they armed themselves and patrolled, they knew they were militarized. They used the same weapons they'd used during the war. When police started an arms race with the mob during Prohibition, that was militarization, and they made that choice. It was a conscious choice to bolster police and militarize them during the war on drugs, and it was to target black and brown people as well as activists. And the change didn't come slowly, it came quickly, with sudden, brutal violence for people of color. Police dropping bombs on black neighborhoods from helicopters wasn't a gradual process, it was sudden and shocking and overwhelming military force permitted by the state. His own story confirms that militant tactics have always been wrapped up in policing. That kind of violence from them was possible from the moment there were police in black communities. They were born from that level of violence, from the violation of human rights, for the protection of unjust laws and private property. On top of this, Balko also justifies the police taking down the Black Panthers, the civil rights group that was known for protecting people from violent police and feeding kids free breakfast. Though it was only by sheer luck that the bumbling raid wasn't a bloody disaster and the tactics themselves ultimately contributed to the acquittals of very dangerous suspects the entire operation was designed to put in prison, the country's maiden high-profile SWAT raid was also a massive, uncompromising show of force against an organization that was widely feared and despised by politicians, law enforcement officials, and most Americans whose politics fell outside the far left. At one point, while discussing the ways that politicians fought to allow no-knock raids, he points out that cops had already been doing no-knock raids and then coming up with justification later. The laws that made it legal to do that were more of a way of providing oversight, though in my opinion it was more a way to allow cops to avoid accountability since the illegal thing they were doing was now legalized. They weren't being delivered accountability but justification, an out. And all of policing history is like this in America, a slow process of police overstepping their bounds and then that overstep being made legal in some form or regulated but never actually stopped. And I'm confused. If I'm reading it wrong, please let me know. Please let me know. We're learning together. As time goes on, police militarization continues and will get worse. The justification for this militarization originally was the war on drugs, but what a lot of people don't know is that the government was blatantly lying about the war on drugs, kind of how they blatantly lied about the war on terror. The CIA intentionally helped drug traffickers get their products to America, and intentionally had them flood black and brown communities with those products. This gave them the false pretense that they needed to ramp up police militarization, increase patrols and surveillance on black and brown neighborhoods, and raid people's homes. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Notice his wording. Nixon's administration considered black people literally the enemy. When police militarized in the name of suppressing drug crimes, it was this: targeted suppression of black protests and progressive movements. The police militarized to suppress riots and protests in response to unjust killings during the Watts riots and after, so on and so forth, and the process did not ever stop. Even now, after the summer uprisings, they're getting new technology and new weapons and new ways of suppressing protests. It didn't start with Nixon either. I mentioned a story earlier of a riot that had to be put down in Boston over people trying to prevent an escaped slave from being captured and sent back into slavery. Some police departments were only created with the specific purpose of putting down workers' unions and strikes. The US Marshals basically existed in the Old West purely to kill indigenous people protecting their lands and Mexican settlers who lived in the West, while the US was working on murdering everyone there and forcing the survivors onto reservations so white people could move there. From their conception, the police were created with an enemy in mind that consisted of innocent people who were inconvenient to the state and capital. The LAPD did a poor job of screening applicants for violent backgrounds, and the department's training put far too much emphasis on force and too little on communication and problem solving. The commission quickly found that when academy students went out in the field, they were quickly schooled to view the world from a we-they perspective. It also found that many of the field training officers who gave new cops their first experiences on the street themselves had histories of misconduct or excessive use of force. The police received training, and still do, that emphasize how they are at war and cannot trust the communities they're serving. They were taught to see the people as their enemy and were given the tools to put us down whenever we organized for reform or progress. The police aren't just taught to think this way though, they actively enjoy it. The police don't do violence with reluctance, they actively pursue it, instigating situations, egging people on, bullying them, giving contradictory orders that are impossible to follow, then beating and killing people for not following them. I have watched the police, while shooting protests, smile and laugh. In Wisconsin, Marquette County Sheriff Rick Fulmer actually disbanded his department's SWAT team in 1996. Quite frankly, they get excited about dressing up in black and doing this kind of thing, Fulmer told the Madison Capital Times. I said, "This is ridiculous. All we're going to do is end up getting people hurt." After one particular raid where the police invaded the wrong home, brutalized the occupants, and shot their dogs in the face, the sheriff, after being asked about it, said, "Quite frankly, we'd do it again, tonight." No matter how much you trust or love cops, they have been trained to never trust you and to hate you vehemently if you display any form of dissent. They are taught to think of themselves as separate from the communities they serve and consider any form of disobedience or disagreement a threat, and they take pleasure in hurting people. Speaking from my own multiple experiences with police brutality at protests, there is no training that can be given to stop them. There's a certain way that they look at you when they decide that they want to hurt you, when you realize that you're the one they're going to target. It gives me chills, and I've seen that look directed at me multiple times. It's terrifying. On August 26th, LAPD trapped a crowd of protesters in the 3rd Street Tunnel in downtown Los Angeles. They waited until we'd walked partway through and trapped us from both sides. Some of the protesters at the front carried shields because they'd been shot at unprompted before, and the police assured us after some negotiation that if we put down the shields, they would let us go. The moment that the shields were down and everyone had their hands up, they opened fire. They shot us, beat us, and tortured us for almost an hour, and when they finally let us go, they searched all of us. This was my 3rd experience with police brutality. It was by no means my last or my worst. I was taught by my parents how to behave if I encounter cops, but what I've learned is that it doesn't matter how good you are. If they want to hurt you, they will, and among each other they celebrate it. Here in Los Angeles, LASD is a police department literally full of gangs. This is why Deputy Miguel Vega murdered an 18-year-old boy while he was at work, on his knees, with his hands up, several feet away. He was shot in the back. Miguel Vega was seeking membership in a gang called the Executioners. These are cops, people who were supposed to protect us. When people protested, they were shot, tear-gassed, and assaulted. They did the same thing to people protesting the killing of Fred Williams, also shot in the back. Both Andres and Fred Williams were unarmed. At protests, they shot, beat, and tear-gassed us again. Journalists had their cameras destroyed or taken by LASD, and at a subsequent press conference to talk about what happened, LASD showed up with full riot gear and threatened the people speaking. And I was there for all of that. The press conference, the protests, everything. I was watching a nature documentary on Netflix a few months ago, and there was a part that I remember coming to where this lion is like trapped in a tree, and there's dozens of Cape buffalo below her waiting for her to fall so they can kill her. And I think she manages to cling there for about 10 minutes before she slips and falls, and there's nothing she can do to escape. And I wanted her to so badly. Like, I remember watching this and like wishing somehow she could escape, like literally praying for it, but nothing. The buffalo killed her, and Watching her helplessly struggle, knowing it's not possible to survive at all, there's zero chance, literally none, is disturbing. Watching George Floyd be strangled by police felt exactly the same. The way police kill people feels the same. There's nothing you can do, no way out. There was nothing George Floyd or Andres Guardado or Philando Castile or Tamir Rice or Fred Williams or AJ Weber or Breonna Taylor could have done differently. Every black child has the talk with their parents about what to do if you encounter police to make sure you survive. But there's nothing you can do when police form gangs dedicated to killing civilians, who pride themselves on it with names like the Reapers, Executioners, the Linwood Vikings, the 3,000 Boys, and others. What the f do you do then? These cops clearly don't serve us, so who do they serve? Who are they loyal to? They trapped us in the tunnel while we were about like halfway through, and I remember like being basically like at the front of the crowd and seeing the police line and at the end of the tunnel come out and like telling people like we have to turn back, and then looking back and seeing that there were like more cops there too, so we couldn't really go anywhere and we were just trapped. And after they trapped us, the police said if everyone who has a shield puts their shield down, then we'll let everyone go. And everyone put their shields down, everyone had their hands up. And of course, you know, you can't trust police because they lie. And of course, in that case, they lied. And instead of letting everyone go like they promised they would, they started firing into the crowd from behind us first with their less than lethal rounds. It was so weird. Like I to this day I don't understand why, but they were like lying and saying like, oh, that's not the police shooting, that's not the police. And I was like, I remember being confused because I'm like, who else would be shooting? Like like what else could possibly be happening? And I could like hear the people being shot at behind me screaming, and then they started doing the same thing at the front and shooting at people and stuff, and grabbing people and beating them and dragging them away and stuff. And when they started shooting, like they at one point like they pointed the gun at one of the cops pointed their gun at the crowd, and everyone like shrank back and like freaked out, and I got knocked over, and like as people were freaking out, like I got trampled. And one of my friends heard me freaking out, and she grabbed me and helped me, and a couple people like helped me get back to my feet. And then the next thing I remember is that like the police have stopped shooting people and stuff, and now they're telling everyone like to basically like line up, and they're gonna search everyone before they let any of us go. Like we're still trapped in the tunnel at this point. Like everyone's still trapped, and like they've been shooting and, you know, blowing us to hell for like 20 minutes in there now. And then we line up together, and when they're like searching people like 3 or 4 at a time, because there's like they're separating people into groups like boys and girls. And so I get in the line also with one of my friends, and we got in line, and they started searching people. And when like my group of people was about to get searched, they got my friends first, and then once they were done, like they got me, and like they only had like me. As far as I remember, like I was the only one that was being searched like at that point, because they like hadn't gotten any more people. But the people that I was with, they had them like move on. Like they tried to wait for me, and the cops really told them to leave, and like made them go on without me. And they waited until they were pretty far away, like before they started searching me. And that was when the cop that searched me sexually assaulted me. And like I when it happened, I wanted to say something, or like I froze, because like I flinched, like I was gonna say something or anything. And I look back a little bit, and like I can see all the all the cops behind me have, weapons and stuff, and it's just like I realize, like, if I fuck up, if I move, like, I'm just gonna get blown to hell. Like, there's nothing I can do. Repeated acts of police violence against black people have caused mass demonstrations and public concern, and frequent depictions of these incidences have had a significant effect on the psychological well-being of black families and communities, who are much more likely to experience police brutality than whites. In 2018, researchers at the School of Public Health at Boston University and the University of Pennsylvania published a study demonstrating that increased incidences of violence in which African Americans were harmed and killed by police were associated with increased depression, tension, and other mental health issues among blacks. In other words, as Lisa H. Thoreau and Jonathan Wald wrote in USA Today, systemic police brutality is damaging the mental health of African Americans, even those who have no direct connection to the men, women, and teens who have lost their lives. Using mental health assessment data and police shooting database, the researchers also found that when police officers killed unarmed black people, it had a heightened impact on the mental health of black Americans living in the same state, reported John Elligan, 2018, in the New York Times. White Americans' mental health was not found to be similarly affected, nor did they report experiencing a similar response to the deaths of unarmed white Americans at the hand of police officers. Just over the last summer and fall, thousands of people experienced the horror of unrestrained police violence, with many people coming off permanently disfigured, permanently injured, traumatized, hospitalized, and losing their lives. During a time where the government couldn't pass checks to the people who needed them so they could pay their rent and eat, also pledged to increase police spending, and had unlimited resources to create tear gas so potent it shreds through gas masks, employed the use of taser shields, shoot and grenade protesters into submission, and more. Speaking personally, after having seen almost all of that happen, I'm terrified. I can't even bring myself to leave my house half of the time. My PTSD is so intense that every noise scares me. Every person who holds eye contact too long is an undercover cop stalking me. I'm intensely paranoid. I can't sleep. I'm doing terrible in school because I can't focus. I get flashbacks and intrusive thoughts. I'm barely functioning. I'm barely surviving. In Los Angeles, for example, a U.S. District Court judge found in 1991 that members of a local sheriff's department had formed a neo-Nazi gang and habitually terrorized Black and Latino residents. In Chicago, John Burge, a police detective and rumored KKK member, was fired and eventually prosecuted in 2008 over charges relating to the torture of at least 120 Black men during his decades-long career. Burge notoriously referred to an electric shock device he used during interrogations as the nigger box. In Cleveland, officials found that a number of police officers had scrawled racist or Nazi graffiti throughout their department's locker rooms. In Texas, 2 police officers were fired when it was discovered that they were Klansmen. One of them said he tried to boost the organization's membership by giving an application to a fellow officer he thought shared his white, Christian, heterosexual values. This is Dave Grossman. Dave Grossman is a world-famous police trainer, known for writing books like On Killing, On Sheep, Sheepdogs, and Wolves, and for being an expert in the art of killology, which is the nerdiest, most geeky shit I've ever heard anyone say in my goddamn life, you anime nerd-sounding motherfucker. This man has given police trainings all around the world, and is known for having given quotes like this: "We fight violence. What do we fight it with? Superior violence. Righteous violence." There is strong evidence that there exists a genetic predisposition for aggression. In all species, the best hunter, the best fighter, the most aggressive male survives to pass his biological predispositions on to his descendants. There is also environmental processes that can fully develop this predisposition toward aggression. When we combine this genetic predisposition with an environmental development, we get a killer. It should be dangerous to attack a warrior. When we turn our protectors into cowed puppies, they sometimes do not even have the spirit to defend themselves from a kick of an ungrateful public, and in the end, they may not be able to protect us and our loved ones at the moment of truth. Grossmen in training like his teach cops to view themselves, as we mentioned earlier, as separate from the communities they serve, but also to see themselves as the uncontested masters of violence with the unquestionable authority to inflict violence on other people, lest the wolves, gangbangers, and thugs, as he himself would call them, commit crimes and hurt people. Grossmen in similar police trainings convince cops that there are enemies lurking around every corner, that every person is a threat, that every object is a weapon, and that no level of violence should be too much when dealing with these people. The use of these violent, borderline eugenicist talking points combined with racially coded language like thug, gangbangers, and predators, all of which are terms weaponized against people of color and especially black people, combined with the capitalistic and white supremacist history of policing, all create a toxic miasma of a mentality within cops that causes them to become people who relish violence, who use it as their primary tool to solve every problem, since everything police do is potentially deadly according to these people that train them. Whether it's bringing a child home, or solving a mental health crisis, or dealing with the homeless. Police training programs have also been caught using quotes and rhetoric from violent genocidal monsters like Adolf Hitler and Robert E. Lee. If you think that what I've just described can be reformed, you can just click off of this video now. I can't convince you of otherwise. Police cannot ever be reformed. Previous attempts at reform have just dumped more money into police departments for training that instead just ended up in their pockets. You can't reform a police gang, and they're more than likely to retaliate any attempts. The only acceptable option is total abolition. Instead of giving billions of dollars to police, we should be investing that money in the people who desperately need it, providing mental health care and physical health care to everyone, which will help prevent crime, solving homelessness by giving the homeless homes, which will prevent crime, demilitarizing the police, which will prevent crime, decriminalizing sex work and drug use, decriminalizing sex work and drug use, decriminalizing sex work and drug use. Reforming the police themselves won't work. Diversity in police departments is completely irrelevant. All cops are loyal to their badge and what it represents first and foremost, not any race or minority group. Previous attempts at reform aimed more at training and body cams haven't made a difference because that money ends up paying for training like Grossman's or ends up just increasing paychecks. And cops can just turn their body cams off or not turn them on at all, or just not wear them, or claim that they're at the station charging, or delete the footage, or just never release the footage, or claim it was accidentally deleted or lost. You cannot reform cops when cops are in charge of the implementation of those reforms. In LA, they literally lied about defunding the police and then didn't. Garcetti said he thought there should be more trans cops on the LAPD and then never hired any, and frankly, I don't want them to. Inclusivity within these institutions is so irrelevant. All having trans cops on LAPD would do is make sure that the next person killed by police would be killed by a trans officer. How is that any better? I have no faith in police or the justice system, and you shouldn't either, because even if the police kill black and brown people the most, they will still kill anyone they want, and they will get away with it every single time. We need mental health professionals and resources for domestic violence and sexual assault survivors and departments that actually investigate rape cases instead of letting hundreds and hundreds of cases where the culprit is known and the evidence is there just sit in evidence lockers for years with no action. We don't need roaming bands of white supremacists patrolling our streets protecting private property to keep us safe, because they're not keeping us safe. When we peacefully protest, they beat us, they shoot us, they ambush us in a tunnel, and sexually assault us. When is enough finally enough?